Maybe he is born of grit and hellfire. By all Marvel known. Get Off My Sheets. Chapter 2. October 2020. Matt knew she was coming from a block away. Jessica Jones had a loud heartbeat that hardly ever wavered, and the smell of whiskey and leather was a constant cloud around her. He immediately went tense and sat up straighter at his desk. "Matt?" Karen asked uneasily. "She's here," he said, pulling his jacket on and getting up from his chair. "Can you grab Foggy, please?" "Of course," Karen said, her voice at its most soothing. She squeezed his shoulder as she passed by. He had tried hard to hide how badly this was affecting him, but he supposed that they knew him so well it hardly mattered. It didn't occur to him until later that they were probably almost as invested in the outcome of this as he was. They'd had 2 years of weekly stories, stolen teachers' reports, and class pictures. Matt wouldn't ask how Jessica got them, but Karen and Foggy were both over the moon to have them. Karen had even offered to copy one and have it framed for Matt's desk, but he'd refused. Their clients were friends, neighbors, people who knew them, even if only casually. He didn't want them to start asking questions about the little boy in the pictures, questions he didn't have the heart to answer. He didn't feel right about people in Hell's Kitchen knowing he was a father when Peter didn't know it. And that wasn't even approaching what would happen if Maggie heard someone commenting on that blind lawyer's new kid. She'd stolen something else for Matt, Peter's scarf. She'd muttered an excuse about pictures being no good to him. He wanted to tell her he didn't need it, wanted to say they should put it back. It was a homemade thing, knitted from a high-quality wool, maybe even merino. Matt could tell just by the feel. Jessica said it was striped in red and blue, and his fingers could feel the ribbed pattern of the stitches. It was wrapped around Peter's neck every day, and somehow she had known it would smell the most like him. No matter how much he told himself that stealing a child's possession was wrong, Matt couldn't make himself bring it back to him. "What if he gets a cold?" he'd asked instead. It was impossible to really meet Matt's eyes, of course, but whenever she was very emotional, Jessica never even bothered to try. She'd mumbled, "It's fine, Murdoch. I made him another one." You knit him a scarf?" "I knit that one too. When the smell fades, you'll have to switch them. They're designed to look the same. He'll never know." Foggy would have had words with Jessica about how much she was enabling the inner stalker in him, but Matt could only come up with gratitude, holding the piece of wool to his nose. It smelled like him, like that unique combination of Matt and Jessica that was only Peter's, like Alyssa and Brian and Jack and Maggie before them, like long days playing in fallen leaves and short nights walking through the snow. It smelled of the happiness of childhood, and Matt couldn't bring himself to part with it until the scents had completely died. Matt didn't realize until after he made the switch that the scarf Peter now held would smell like him. Foggy finished chatting with his client in time to walk into the room as Jessica stormed through the door. Her heart was drumming so hard that Matt was already concerned, but it wasn't relieved at all by the absence of her speech. Instead, Jessica paced around the space, tearing a hand through the tangle of her hair. It took her a moment before she finally spat. "Syracuse, Murdoch. Fucking Syracuse." Matt's heart slammed against his chest and Karen gasped. "I thought they were taking him to New Rochelle." That still wasn't ideal, but New Rochelle wasn't that much farther from Manhattan than Queens. Syracuse was hours away. Even if you took a car rather than mass transportation, something he knew Jessica avoided like the plague, forget the weekly and sometimes bi-weekly checks. They'd be lucky to see him once a month in Syracuse. "Foster family fell through," Jessica croaked, tugging her own hair restlessly. Foster mother wasn't sure about having a male foster child in the house with her two biological daughters. Never mind that Peter's only 7, for fuck's sake. Fuck, Matt hissed, jaw clenched, beginning to pace as well. She collapsed into a seat. We're screwed, Murdoch. Not necessarily, Foggy murmured, fingers tapping mindlessly on the surface of the conference table. Well, hopefully both of you, because this could get very messy otherwise. How would you feel about asking the state of New York to give you your child back? Matt was speechless. Jessica was not. Can't, she said hoarsely. Didn't Murdoch tell you? Foggy's face softened, but his eyes still focused on hers intently. Yeah, Matt told us how Kilgrave forced you to sign the papers. But you did it under duress. Low and broken down with emotional exhaustion, Jessica said, I've tried telling people the truth, Nelson. They don't want to believe me. Mind control is way too scary for most people to think about. They'd rather believe I'm crazy. Foggy lifted a finger. I didn't say we should convince them mind control is real. I said you did it under duress. Would you agree with that statement? Lawyers, she whispered, for once sounding almost relieved rather than disgusted. He grinned. The best in the business, baby. We're not L&Z or Hogarth, Chow, and Benowitz. We actually put in the work. You were in the hospital when you signed the papers. Was Kilgrave there with you in the room when you signed? Yeah, of course. He rarely left me alone longer than it took to take a piss. Were you afraid for your life? Yes, she said slowly. Maybe not in the front of her mind where Kilgrave had all the control, but she was very definitely afraid back in that tiny corner where her real self was buried. Were you afraid for the life of your child? Not even his life. Did you think Kilgrave was capable of hurting your baby in any way? Yes, she said, with such venomous that Foggy jumped. He hated kids. I met a man who was forced to abandon his toddler on the side of the road so he could give Kilgrave a ride. If they annoyed him enough, he'd force them to punish themselves, eat cinnamon, even when they choked, slam their hands in an oven door. If they were afraid of water, he'd tell them to go swimming. If they were afraid of the dark, he'd lock them in a closet. Jesus Christ, Matt breathed, and Karen made a low, vivid noise of someone forcing down their gag reflex. Okay, Foggy agreed, clearly just as disturbed. Would you be willing to swear that to a judge, Jessica? Not the mind control, just that when you signed, you were concerned for Peter's welfare. Yeah, I guess so. Would you be willing to swear that Matt didn't know he had a child and that you never contacted him about Peter until after you lost custody? If that would help. Did you know that Peter was Matt's child, or was his paternity uncertain? Matt found his voice. She knows. She always knew that I was the father. How the hell did you know that? Jessica demanded, turning in her seat to glare at him. Matt might be blind, but she was sure he could feel the knives in her stare from across the room. Your heartbeat. When you saw my face the second time we met, when you saw me, your heart started going crazy, and at the time, I thought you were nervous about the strange man claiming to be your lawyer. But after less than a day of knowing you, I knew that wouldn't make you that anxious. Didn't put the rest together until I realized you were watching Peter in the park. Yeah, I knew, Jessica agreed with a sigh. I hope your next girlfriend's vagina is made of actual titanium, because the morning after pill is supposed to be 95% effective. But whatever you got slips past that other 5%, Murdoch. Foggy laughed. It was loud and hearty. It was in a loud and hearty way that meant Matt was going to be hearing about this little anecdote for the rest of their goddamn lives. Blushing, he rubbed his hand over his face, coughed, and said, "Yeah, I'll take that into consideration." "Thanks, Jess. So, is that the plan, Fogg? We're gonna say that the state of New York took my son without my consent when the mother signed under duress?" "That's basically the plan, yeah," Foggy said, clearly pleased with himself. Jessica obviously agreed to give him up under the assumption that Kilgrave would harm her child. Mind controller, no. "And nobody asked you if you were okay with giving him up. Heads up, they are definitely going to ask for a blood test. But it's pretty clear they'll find out what we already know. I'm confident that even if they wouldn't agree to trash Jessica's agreement, they're not going to refuse both of you. Especially if Jessica is willing to testify that Matt didn't know he had a son until years later." Jessica grunted and nodded in agreement. "Okay, that's great, but that kind of misses a great big question here. What are we going to do with him once we have custody?" Karen and Foggy both blinked and gave her a blank stare for several long moments before Matt sighed and said, "She's right. We aren't fit parents. All the reasons we have for not regaining custody before now haven't gone away." Thoughtfully, he murmured, "Maybe St. Agnes? He'd be safe there, and Maggie could watch over him." Karen was shocked, speechless, and Foggy responded with, "You are absolutely shitting me right now." Jessica made a face. "What is St. Agnes? Who is Maggie? And why do your friends look like you just shoved a whole stick up their asses?" "St. Agnes is a Catholic home for children," Matt explained. "I grew up there. Maggie's my mother. She left when I was a baby, and we didn't regain contact until I was an adult. She's a nun there. She'd make sure Peter was all right." I have no idea why Foggy and Karen are freaking out. I assume it's because Foggy is still mad at Maggie for refusing to come forward as my mother 20 years ago, and Karen isn't comfortable with religion. "It's not great," Jess said. "I'm not crazy about the Catholic part, but it isn't the dumbest idea we've ever had." "Let me get this straight. You want me to get your son back for you," Foggy said, enunciating every word so that each syllable was laced through with fury, "so that you can dump him in an orphanage and leave him there? They raised me. They couldn't have done that bad a job," Matt argued, and Jess gave a thoughtful hum. "Yes, of course," Foggy agreed sarcastically. "You're totally normal, except for the almost uncontrollable rage and anxiety and the sense of deep, unending sadness you carry with you at all the time. I really hope you're taking steps to make sure Maggie and I never meet, because that won't go well, Matt. The first thing I plan on asking her is how the fuck she was totally fine with watching her son learn how to starve himself of human affection and basic attention right in front of her own fucking eyes." Foggy. Matt was getting the sad, kicked puppy face he had when he was really upset, but Foggy by that point was even more upset and not willing to listen. "Are you okay with that too?" he demanded. "Are you going to be chill with watching Peter learn how to shut himself off from basic human needs, Matt? He needs you, man. Are both of you just gonna walk away from that?" Grabbing his friend by the arm, Matt dragged him off to one of the inner offices at Nelson, Murdoch, and Page and shut the door. "I know you're mad at Maggie. Understatement," he gritted out. "But you're really freaking Jessica out," Matt said quietly. head cocked as he listened to her short, sharp intakes of air. She already felt guilty about what a terrible mother she'd be. Imagining that happening to Peter couldn't be helpful. Listen to me. Just listen for a minute. I want to be his dad, Fogg. I want to take him. But first, and most importantly, the last thing I want to do is force Jessica to do anything, especially force her to become a suitable mother overnight. She isn't, and she knows that, and I'm not going to do this without her. Peter has 2 parents, and he deserves to have attention from both of them, not just the one who's the least traumatized. Secondly, I know almost nothing about children. I was largely left in relative isolation after the accident. The other kids wanted nothing to do with the blind kid, and the blind kid thought they were too fucking loud. And this is a minor complaint, but she and I both have jobs, and don't exactly know any reliable babysitters. Excuse you, Foggy huffed. Karen and I would be fantastic babysitters. With jobs, and you work as often as I do. Probably more on a regular work day when you consider my hobby. Which leads to a whole other world of problems. There was a pause. Long enough for Foggy to realize that Matt had finished talking. Okay, my turn. You're going to ask Jessica if she's okay with you having full-time custody of Peter. Then you're going to tell her she can take him whenever she's ready to. Stay with her every other weekend, after school visits once a week, whatever she feels like she can handle. I know half the people in the kitchen. We'll find you someone reliable to babysit when you need them. And we'll find some audiobooks for you on parenting and child psychology and whatnot. Let you get your research on, Mr. Summa Cum Laude. And Daredevil? Matt asked, brow lifted. Foggy has put serious thought into this. Daredevil is gonna have to be a serious, emergencies only kind of hero, he said, sympathetic but unyielding. I know the city needs Daredevil. I won't argue with that with you anymore. But Peter needs his father more, Matt. Okay, we're gonna do it. We'll file the paperwork first thing tomorrow. Let's talk to Jessica. Out in the main conference room, Jessica pressed the heels of her palms into her eyes and muttered, I don't think I can do this. Karen gave her a reassuring smile. No one has perfect parents, but both of you always put his best interests first. I think that's half the battle. As the men re-entered the room and she saw Matt's face, she gently said, Does this mean I get to be a godmother? With a reluctant, rather tragic smile, Matt nodded. That's the plan. She cried gleefully, I'm a godmother! Shoot! I've missed so many birthdays. Jessica sat cross-legged on her desk and surveyed the room around her, running her fingers absent-mindedly through the skeins of yarn next to her hip. Knitting was one of the few activities she did sober. It required concentration, dexterity, and patience, and drinking wasn't compatible with any of those things. From the moment Nelson and Murdoch revealed their plan, Jessica had been trying to convince herself that Peter would be safe in this apartment, and she couldn't do it. Price had tried to shoot Jess and her mom in this room. Simpson had thrown her through a wall in this room. Kilgrave had walked right in and forced Reuben to slit his throat in her own bed. She was where she worked, and she liked her job, but she couldn't let her work live with her anymore. She couldn't bring it home with her where Peter was supposed to be. Years ago, she had a room for him. Everything carefully picked out by her and Trish. She wanted to be surprised at the time. Jessica wouldn't let them tell her if she was having a boy or a girl. And his birth was a surprise, all right, just in all the wrong ways. People, mostly Dorothy, had complained to her about the colors. Mint green and cobalt blue were not, according to her, gender neutral. Jessica had blithely informed her that at any time she shoved a person through her vagina, she was free to make their room whatever color she liked. She'd made them herself, the cotton rugs on the floor, the blankets stored in the cupboards. She thought it was silly to make a cap and booties for the child that was due in June. But Jessica had still made them. Every thread had passed through her fingers first. And when she was gone, Jessica couldn't even make herself go back into that room. Trish had packed it up by herself, bawling furiously the whole time. The unused pile of diapers and bottles and onesies shipped off for donation, everything from shoes to pacifiers disappeared in the matter of hours. The only thing Jess had kept for herself was his first blanket, a tiny square of her neatest stitches in chevron stripes of mint green and cobalt blue. She still had it. It lived on the top shelf of her closet, and when she couldn't hold her son or ask about Peter's day, Jessica opened its box and stroked the fine cashmere yarn until she could force herself away. 2 days later, Malcolm walked out of the elevator on their floor to the smell of paint fumes and 2 other apartments left wide open, including Jessica's at the end of their hall. It was late. Hogarth had a whole team in the office until nearly midnight for a very demanding asshole client, and he was left over caffeinated and exhausted, staring into the apartment across the hall from him with uncomprehending surprise. In the empty apartment directly across from him, Jessica stood in the middle of drop cloth and paint cans, her black tank top and ripped jeans splattered in 3 different colors, including the dusty muted copper she was currently coating the living and dining area with. Picked up a new hobby? They didn't really talk. Not like they used to, but Malcolm could probably get her to at least explain the sudden desire for home improvement. Something like that was all she grunted, stooping down to rest her paint roller after the last spot of white was covered. "Looks good," Malcolm said finally. "Warm." Jessica paused, standing and doing a full turn around the room to take it in. Above them, the ceiling fan turned lazy circles, the only sound in the room for several seconds. "Yeah," she said quietly, sounding a little stunned herself, as though she'd done the whole task while sleepwalking. "Yeah, it does." Malcolm left her to it, peering into the open office to alias investigations. He could see through the open space in the living room that there were boxes packed up all over the kitchen counter. As the days went by, Malcolm noticed other odd things happening with his neighbor. Alias' door stayed in the apartment at the end of the hall. Meanwhile, Jessica started bringing IKEA furniture into the apartment across from him. A metal loft bed frame with a built-in desk, bookshelves, a dresser, a set of chairs. A week after he watched Jessica finish painting the living room across the hall, he left his apartment for a quick milk run and found her and another familiar face carrying up a second-hand dining room table. Don't keep trying to lift it," Jessica said, impatiently hefting the table. "I don't need help carrying it." Then why the hell am I here?" Foggy griped good-naturedly. "Because it's an awkward size. I can carry it. It's just fucking hard to turn corners with it. Besides, I can't figure out how to get the fridge to stop making that noise. I'm tempted to kick it into a little can and tell the landlord I'll pay for a new one." "Oh God," he replied. "I'll look at it. Just please don't do anything else to it." "Oh, hey, the Cass." "Nelson?" Malcolm greeted. "Hi, how's private practice?" "Very glamorous, as you can see," Foggy said solemnly, helping Jessica turn the table into the doorway. Still swimming with the sharks with Hogarth?" Yeah. The lowering of the table provided a view of 4 chairs awaiting its presence in the dining area, with a beautiful antique lamp, also bought secondhand, hanging above them. Jessica had moved the mid-century sofa from the office into the living room. Various plants were scattered around the room. "Nice to see you, man. Hit me up later, we'll have a beer," he said politely and effectively telling Malcolm to get lost. With a nod and a wave, he retreated to the elevator. Your secretary is a maniac," Jess grumbled, looking around the room at all the greenery. "What am I gonna do with all these fucking houseplants?" "You have to admit, it makes the room look nicer, though," Foggy said lightly, helping her to unpack the kitchen items into their new places. "Be grateful Karen is too busy with Matt to spend more time on it. Matt looks more harassed every time she goes over there." "What's wrong with his house?" Jessica asked curiously, walking into the master bedroom so that she could finally clear the last of the personal items from her office. "A blind guy isn't exactly the one you asked for decorating tips, Jess. We had to very gently tell him that while he can't see what it looks like, Peter would be fucking terrified of his living room. It looks like a half-finished warehouse where a homeless man lives." Jessica made a vaguely alarmed noise, looking up from shaking out her sheets over the bed. "No worry, we're working on it," he assured her. "Having a kitchen counter that's not made of plywood will help. Karen's getting some curtains put up too, so it won't look like he's having a rave on that side of the apartment every night." "Have you converted the gym yet? Gotten his room ready?" Jessica sounded uncomfortable, as though she were trying to sound like she didn't care about the answer when she obviously did. "First thing we did," he promised with a grin. "Matt wanted to go crazy with the Star Wars, but I convinced him to let Peter make it his own. But he's likes Star Wars," she replied in a strangely pouty tone. "You weren't supposed to know that already," Foggy said gently. There was an uncomfortable pause as he watched her flip the light on in Peter's room and carefully examine and re-examine every inch of the space. His gaze was caught by the bed. "Oh my God, Jess, did you make this?" Jessica shrugged, her voice carefully nonchalant. "He never got the first one I made. He's outgrown it now. I think blue and red are definitely more his colors anyway." A more muted navy blue for Jessica, a deep stately red for Matt. Jess never even realized she'd substituted the original colors for the ones most closely associated with the two of them until after the scarves were finished, and she admired how well it suited them. When she made the blanket, she kept the chevron stripes, though. Quietly, Foggy said, "He's gonna love it, Jess." He had no idea why Matt and Jess thought they were going to be shitty parents. The obsessive level of detail they put into this just showcased, in Foggy's opinion, how fantastic they were going to be. Peter's mind was completely blank as Miss March, "You can call me Kelly, Peter, it's okay," walked him into the waiting room. He was going to live with his biological parents. He'd always known he was adopted. The Parkers had never made that a secret to him. May always told him that his bio mom, whoever she was, had given them a beautiful gift by letting them adopt Peter, even if it was the hardest thing she'd ever had to do. Peter had asked many times what she looked like, sounded like, what her name was, but they'd had to be honest. They had to tell him they didn't know. Never, not in his wildest imaginings, especially when Miss March told him May wasn't coming back, had he ever thought that both of his bio parents were coming back to get him. Miss March opened the door to the waiting room, several people sitting there, all grown-ups. He saw them first. Peter will always remember that he saw them first. They were the first people his eyes locked on. No way that's them, was his thought then. These people are too cool to be my parents. Peter Parker was a nerd, a geek. Even at 7, he understood that. These people were not. So very not. The man was wearing sunglasses indoors, the frames glowing an eerie red around his face, echoing the way the lights made his dark hair shine reddish brown. Stubble covered his cheeks, despite his nice suit, and he was sitting very well, very still. The woman was slouching in her seat, hands tucked into her leather jacket. Like her jacket, her boots were worn black leather, and her jeans were ripped and faded. She had dark hair, a slick blue-black that framed her pale face. They looked like they belonged on a magazine, not in a child services waiting room. Jessica, the man said, low and warm. His posture was a bit strange, head held slightly tilted. Blind, Peter realized. Taking in the white stick in his side, he was blind. Immediately, the woman's eyes were on Peter, and she sat up from her relaxed pose. Hello, Peter, she said, and his eyes widened in disbelief. But she spoke right to him, eyes drinking him in. I'm Jess. It's nice to finally meet you. Her voice was rough, sweet. That was his mother's voice, his mother's hand, narrow and white, reaching out to shake his. Hello, Jess. His eyes darted between her and the man in the suit. This is Matt, she said, using her other hand to nudge the man's arm, and he also held it out for Peter to shake. Matt smiled at him as their hands touched, slow and warm, just like his voice. He didn't know why, but that made Peter's heart beat faster, almost as fast as looking into his mother's eyes had. When Matt shook his hand, it felt rough. It was sort of the opposite of his suit, just like the scruff on his face. Peter liked it. We've been wanting to meet you for a long time, Peter. You have? He asked, amazed and smiling at them tentatively. Of course, Jess said. She was lost, gone from that moment onward. Kilgrave didn't have 1% of the power over her that her 7-year-old son had. Looking in the eyes and smiling at her, she never doubted that she would do anything for him, but today was the first day that she could. Every day since you were born. An odd shiver passed through Peter as each of them took one of his hands, standing up to leave that lonely waiting room. Matt squeezed his hand lightly, as though he could tell. Jess led all 3 of them out. These are my parents. End of chapter.